Hi, my name is Morris Franco. This is my 8th video in this series on the national debt crisis. In this video, I will attempt to show how the crisis will play out. The question is not if, but when the national debt will blow up. When that happens, it will cause a major economic crisis in the United States and probably throughout the entire free world. As I see it, there are 4 major players who had a role in creating the crisis and who will have a role in determining how it plays out, regardless of the ultimate outcome. They are the government, the Federal Reserve, the major credit rating agencies, and the investor. In the previous 7 videos, I spelled out the importance of each player and what their part is in relation to the national debt. As the national debt grows, the major cause of that growth will shift from deficit spending to the mandatory interest expense of funding the debt. Now let me repeat that statement. As the national debt grows, the major cause of that growth will shift from deficit spending to the mandatory interest expense of funding the debt. In the last 21 years, 1994 through 2014, the government budgeted $5.5 trillion just to pay debt interest. That entire $5.5 trillion is now part of the national debt. In other words, it was the national debt itself that was responsible for a major portion of the growth in the debt. The best case scenario. It all comes down to the mindset of the investor. Remember the S&P downgrade in August of 2011? The downgrade rocked the stock market. Yet in spite of the downgrade, investors ran to what they believed was the safety of U.S. government bonds. If there ever was a demonstration of the mindset of the investor, that was it. They ran to U.S. Treasury securities as a safe haven from the turbulence in world markets caused by the downgrade of these very same securities by S&P. This is pure speculation on my part. If memory serves me correctly, prior to the Ben Bernanke era at the Federal Reserve, bond investors would have reacted differently. That is, bond values would have also taken a hit because of the S&P downgrade, believing the downgrade was a direct hit to the credit worthiness of the United States. But I think these days bond investors have a different view on the safety of U.S. Treasury securities. I think they believe the Federal Reserve has their back and will ensure the safety of Treasury securities by stepping in and purchasing U.S. debt when bond investors become reluctant. The $4 trillion bond buying program that the Federal Reserve undertook to ensure that the low interest rate policy would not be challenged by bond investors punished investors who were pessimistic on U.S. debt and kept interest rates at record low levels. This shill game by the Fed created what I believe is overconfidence in U.S. debt. This overconfidence, in my opinion, is not based on the investors' faith in the strong creditworthiness of the United States, but rather the belief that the Federal Reserve will again step up and purchase more bonds to force rates down and again punish investors who are pessimistic on the quality of U.S. debt. I previously stated that it would ultimately be the bond investor who will bring the national debt problem to a head by backing off the purchase of Treasury securities because of the rotting financial condition of the United States. The need for the Federal Reserve to entice bond investors by boosting interest rates, along with the growth in the national debt, will ultimately require such huge annual debt interest payments that it will make it impossible to continue funding the debt. This will be accompanied by a series of debt downgrades by the major credit agencies and ultimately lead to a restructuring of the debt and a partial default by the U.S. government. This action will mean economic Armageddon for the United States, bringing on a crisis beyond my imagination. Some of the possible consequences of a default were discussed in previous videos. I also explained why growing our way out of the debt problem is just a fantasy, and that the growth in the national debt far outpaced the growth in the economy. Option number 1, the balanced budget option. As I see it, there is only one possible method of avoiding a disastrous outcome. The method is both simple and obvious, but also very painful and almost next to impossible to execute. The answer is simply a balanced budget. That is, balanced to the point that will freeze the growth in the national debt. The goal being that with the national debt frozen at a fixed amount, its significance will diminish over time as the economy grows. Just for the record, in the 6 years of the Obama presidency, the economy grew at an annual rate of less than 2%. During that same period, deficit spending exceeded 30% of the budget. Put another way, budget deficits over that 6-year period was close to all the income collected in taxes for 2 full years. In theory, if the amount budgeted for debt interest remained constant, then any revenue growth could be used to expand existing programs. In order to achieve a balanced budget, Congress must go through the painful process of cutting ongoing programs or increasing taxes. Over the last 2 years, budget deficits averaged about $500 billion a year. According to the CBO, the budget deficit for the first half of 2015 was $430 billion. If you use 2016 as an example, we would be talking about budget cuts in the range of $500, $600 billion or more. As disagreeable as these suggestions are, the most painful action may be the need to cut spending even more to offset any interest rate increase sure to come when the Federal Reserve starts to normalize interest rates. At the present time, the Fed has set rates at or near record lows, averaging just 1.3% in 2014. It's a certainty the government will not take any action on balancing the budget during the Obama presidency. And it's equally certain that by the time President Obama leaves office, the national debt will be at or near $20 trillion. Therefore, the normalization of interest rates will require a budget allocation of $140 billion to $200 billion for every 1 point hike in interest rates. Let's assume that the Fed wants to normalize interest rates at just 4%. That will increase debt interest from the current $230 billion to a maximum of $800 billion. As rate increases take time to work their way through the system, within 3 years, the government will need to cut the budget by additional $300 to $400 billion. Rate increases affect 40% of the national debt in year 1, 55% in year 2, and 70% in year 3. Bear in mind that over the last 50 years, the average interest rate on U.S. debt was over 6%, and if the Fed chose to go down that path, it would add another additional $280 to $400 billion in debt interest. I hate spouting all this gloom and doom, but the national debt problem cannot be resolved until all the facts surrounding the problem are brought to light. In my opinion, the percentage of the population that truly understands the complexities of the national debt and all the potential problems it will eventually cause is minuscule. The possibility of our government going down this road is next to nil. The actions I just described will require at least $500 billion in budget cuts out of the gate, with major additional budget cuts, probably in excess of $1 trillion, to offset expected interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. Option number 2, business as usual. I call option number 2 the business as usual option because there really is no option number two. Business as usual translates into doing nothing. Doing nothing is a sure road to financial Armageddon. Doing nothing will force the government to eventually default. According to a government website, in 2014, the United States government had $500 billion more in expenses than it received in revenues, thus a $500 billion budget deficit. Can you, in your wildest imagination, envision our politically sensitive senators and congressmen approving $500 to $600 billion in budget cuts? That's a 16% cut. You might remember back in 2013, Congress was forced to cut the budget by only $85 billion, or about 4%, and they cried foul about that. How big a problem is the national debt? At last count, there were about 145 million working Americans. That works out to about $127,000 per person. If you include the 38 million people collecting Social Security, it works out to just under 100,000 per person. Not to worry. Neither of these groups are ever going to pay 5 cents towards paying down the national debt. I'm sure you heard politicians use the following phrase many times. We are borrowing on our children's future. Guess what? That's not true either. So how will this country ever reduce the national debt without anyone forking up money to the government? Forget about reducing the debt through budget surpluses. That's never going to happen. The answer is simple. The investor who owns the treasuries at the time the government defaults will wind up eating the loss. Simple answer, but that's not the way the debt crisis will play out. Know this, no matter how high interest rates go and no matter how low treasury prices fall, there will always be a market for treasury securities. Someone will always find a way to make money. If treasury prices fall to 50 cents on a dollar, there will be someone willing to pay 49 cents. As I previously said, investors backing off the purchase of treasuries will bring the issue to a head. That may happen when investors grow nervous about the credit quality of U.S. debt, or it may follow credit downgrades from the major credit agencies. Either action will push treasury rates higher and reduce the market value of existing treasury securities. The Federal Reserve may try to mitigate the crisis by instituting a massive bond buying program similar to the $4 trillion stimulus program that ended in 2014. That action may initially prove successful as the Fed packs a powerful punch, but ultimately will fail. In fact, any attempt by the Fed in this area will probably backfire and create a crisis of its own, as the action will appear desperate. In any case, high interest rates will create ever higher budget deficits, lower bond values, and a ballooning national debt. At this point, the national debt crisis will feed on itself until it reaches the breaking point. When and if that happens, the government will have no choice but to legislate a partial default on many treasury securities. Needless to say, the nation's economy and stock and bond markets throughout the world will deteriorate into total chaos. This is similar to what Greece did, paying owners of their sovereign debt only 50 cents on a dollar. The act of defaulting on U.S. debt will not unto itself cause economic Armageddon, because that event will have preceded the default. When and if a default takes place, it will not be sudden. In fact, it will be slow and painful. Needless to say, predicting when this event will take place is an impossible task, and of course, my take on how this issue will play out is nothing more than an educated guess. I discuss in these videos what effect the return to normal interest rates will have on the budget, requiring Congress to budget at least $1 trillion every year just to meet interest obligations needed to fund the debt. That figures more than 25% of the current budget and probably 30% of its revenues. That means that when the Fed fully normalizes interest rates, 30% of every tax dollar collected will go into servicing the debt. 30% of every tax dollar collected being siphoned off and providing no benefits to our citizens. In the next 10 years, taxpayers will fork over $10 trillion just to fund the debt. As 34% of the national debt is owned by foreign countries, that means over the next 10 years, U.S. taxpayers will be paying foreign investors at least $3.4 trillion. China and Japan each will get about $1.2 trillion of that. All that said, where's the outcry? Why isn't the public up in arms about this situation? The reason, in my opinion, is that the vast majority of the media and the press are in President Obama's camp and supports his big spending ultra-liberal agenda. Politicians, both Democrats and moderate Republicans, also remain silent. The Democrats because they support the president's programs, and the moderate Rhino Republicans because they will need to spend if and when they come to power. To this day, nothing has changed with regard to government spending, in spite of the drubbing the Republicans gave the Democrats in the 2014 elections. I wish I could quote all those politicians, economists, and op-ed writers who are on the record saying the national debt is manageable. I see these people as either uninformed, stupid, or they sold their soul for political reasons. How high is too high? How much can the national debt grow before investors start to back off, believing Treasury securities are too risky? It's a matter of mindset. At the present time, investors appear to be very comfortable with the credit ratings provided by the major credit agencies and equally comfortable accepting whatever interest rates the Federal Reserve deems appropriate to their view of the current country's economic condition. I discussed this at length in part 7 of my video series on this subject. I envision a national debt of $100 trillion, $200 trillion or more before investors rebel in fear that the United States is carrying too much debt. It's more of a question of how fast the debt grows rather than how high it grows. If the national debt grew at the same rate as the economy, carrying the debt load would be a much less serious problem. Remember, from 1984 to the present, the last 30 years, the national debt grew by over 1,000%, from less than 1.6 trillion to the 18.2 trillion it is today. And if the same growth rate persisted for the next 30 years, the national debt would grow to about $180 trillion. This fact is not a matter of concern to investors, the media, or our political leaders. I believe this is stark proof that our political leaders, with the support of the liberal press, has achieved a major brainwashing victory in convincing the public that our massive debt load is not a serious problem. This is a major concern of mine, especially considering the fact that the debt doubled in size over the last 7 years. The debt growth averaged over $1 trillion a year every year President Obama held office. As I previously said, over the last 7 years, GDP growth averaged about 2%. During that same 7-year period, the national debt grew by 80%, or just under 15% a year. Neither the size of the debt or the speed it grew at seemed to faze the investor or the credit agencies. In my opinion, as long as the credit agencies continue to give U.S. debt their top or near top rating, investors will not balk about the risk in investing in U.S. treasuries, regardless of the size of the national debt or the interest rate set by the Federal Reserve. The path of least resistance. On April 14, 2015, the House of Representatives approved a bill that would increase Medicare compensation to doctors at a cost of $200 billion to taxpayers. That's $214 billion to taxpayers. The law, which is about to go into effect, will prevent a 21% tax cut in doctor fees. 2/3 of the $214 billion needed to finance the bill will come from deficit spending. That one bill will add $140 billion to the national debt. That equates to an IOU to the government of about $1,000 for every working American. The day before, the Treasury Department said that for the first 6 months of fiscal year 2015, the Treasury ran a deficit of $439 billion, bragging that it was a 6% cut from the previous year. At the same time, the Fitch Fitch Rating affirmed the AAA rating of U.S. debt. Fitch added the following one-sentence comment. The U.S. has achieved a rapid fiscal consolidation based on economic recovery and tight spending limits. But further deficit narrowing will be more hard-won. End quote. In my opinion, this is a sick joke. Here we have the government bragging about a budget deficit of $439 billion 6 months into the fiscal year, and we have one of the major credit agencies reaffirming the AAA rating while complimenting Congress on its fiscal discipline. This is another stark illustration of Congress using the national debt as the path of least resistance, the path that is greased, in my opinion, by bogus TOPS ratings issued by the credit agencies. The more I think about it, the more secure I am about my opinions on the subject of the national debt. I believe the government will not address this crisis until forced to, because out-of-control interest rates brought on by reluctant investors. I believe there is a strong possibility the major credit agencies are intimidated into giving U.S. debt their highest ratings. This may be fear of government reprisals similar to events S&P underwent after their 2011 downgrade of U.S. debt, or possibly it is the fear the credit agencies have that their downgrades would roil world economies and world stock and bond markets. I believe there is a strong possibility the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates artificially low because the huge increase in the size of the national debt will make it next to impossible for the government to meet interest requirements, which can only be paid from tax increase, budget cuts, or more budget deficits. I believe President Obama could not care less about the national debt and will spend whatever it takes to achieve his ultra-liberal agenda. I believe outside of a small conservative majority, both the Senate and the House of Representatives will do nothing about the national debt except give it some lip service. The next paragraph comes with some minor changes. It's taken from my book on the national debt crisis, and I think it bears repeating. The paragraph reads, assigning blame for this crisis would appear relatively easy. Of course, the aggressive spending programs by Congress and all the presidents since Ronald Reagan are the main culprits, but the Federal Reserve should share some of the blame. Its charter is to fight inflation and keep unemployment down. While it's true the Fed does not have the power to purse, it does have the power to pulpit. When it speaks, those in power hang on every word. When the national debt crisis blows up, the unemployment rate will skyrocket, and it will almost certainly bring on a recession. The Fed, at a minimum, should have been pounding the table, warning Capitol Hill of the risk associated with unbalanced budget and the ballooning national debt. On this matter, it failed miserably. When I wrote that paragraph, I had Ben Bernanke in mind. I don't recall Janet Yellen, the current head of the Federal Reserve, forcefully addressing this issue either. Summing up, I set an impossible goal for myself. I'm a strong believer in America and the values our founders put into place through the laws that govern our country. I take pride in what American exceptionalism brings to its citizens, and at the same time frustrated by the fact that most Americans haven't a clue to the true meaning of that phrase. I am frustrated by the actions our government is taking, limiting our ability to live our lives as we see fit, rather than controlling more and more of it. I could go on and on, but I think you get my point. In any case, I feel my unique background gives me some insight to the national debt and most of the factors associated with it. So my goal was to alert our country through its citizens about the crisis facing our country. I believe that the percentage of the public that understands the full magnitude of the national debt problem is very low. The first step I took was to write letters to a bunch of editors. That got no place. The second step was to write a detailed explanation of the debt and send it off to media VIPs and financial publications. Again, no results. The third step was to put everything I had written on this subject into a book. As this subject by itself was not enough to fill a book, about 100 pages, I added about 50 pages of my generally conservative opinions on a variety of political issues. To my surprise, the book got a good review on the section devoted to the national debt. However, the reviewer was not too impressed with what I had to say on the other issues. The reviewer was Kirkus Reviews, that's Kirkus Reviews, and the title of the book is The National Debt Crisis, America's Armageddon. Show book, okay. Give myself a little plug. Here's a copy of the book. Okay, enough of that. The book is available for sale from Amazon, and the review can be seen on Kirkus Reviews website. So much for my plug. In any case, I sent about 50 copies of the book to the same group of media VIPs and financial magazines. Again, no results. I then took out ads on Google and Facebook, and between them got over 1,000 likes and clicks, but sold less than 5 books. So these videos are my latest effort at getting the word out. To date, my videos had about 1,300 views, and I sold 3 or 4 more books. So far, my effort to get the word out on the national debt has been a big flop. I have to deal with the fact that the national debt issue doesn't have a big following. But even more important is the fact that resolving the national debt issue will cause great pain to America and its citizens. But if America is going to represent our strong values, it will only be able to do that from a position of strength. Only by addressing the national debt problem can we continue to prosper and show the world what true freedom is. While I remain confident in my opinions on the national debt, I'm sure there are many holes in my analysis. I made some predictions on how I expect the issue to play out through 2020, and even made some projections as far out as 2043. These projections presume no major national or international events throughout the period. Of course, that will not be the case. It is difficult to enlighten fellow Americans on how hard it will be to keep the national debt from growing, and the drastic actions our government will have to take to accomplish that. It's just as difficult to show the longer we go without addressing the problem, the more severe the economic carnage will be. The sooner the government acts, the more control it will have in resolving the problem. Time is not on the government's side. Today, investors worldwide view the United States as the safest place on earth to put their money, in spite of our $18 trillion national debt. In fact, the more severe the economic crisis, the faster they run to the U.S. Treasury markets. 2 of the 3 major credit agencies give the U.S. debt their highest rating in spite of our $18 trillion national debt. Investors worldwide lend us money for 10 to 30 years at less than 4% rate in spite of our $18 trillion national debt. Politicians have successfully convinced the public that the national debt is not a problem, and no citizens has ever knowingly paid 10 cents toward paying down the debt. I guess you can fool most of the people most of the time. As long as the national debt is viewed in this light, it will continue to grow unchecked. It is my opinion our political leaders will not take any action for 10, 20, or 30 years, and the national debt could reach 100 trillion, 200 trillion, or more unless our citizens put pressure on our leaders to take action. That's what these videos in my book is all about. I sincerely believe every patriotic American should have a copy of my book because it clearly shows the extent of the national debt problem, and it lays out the facts for everyone to challenge. I hope you found these videos informative. If you think there is any substance to my message, please pass it along. Thank you for watching my videos.